Okay, let's come back to this Spanda-kārikā. Verse 1, Yasyonmesha nimeshabhyam jagata pralayodayao tam shakti chakra vibhava prabhavam shankaram stuma. We praise the beneficent source of the all-pervasive activity of the wheel of the powers of consciousness, the expansion of which is the arising of the world, and the contraction of which is its dissolution. Okay, so there's a couple ways you can read this. We collectively praise, sing the praises of Shankara. Now, Shankara is a name for Shiva, right? And of course, in Shaivism, the word Shiva really just means the divine or God, right? But you can also take it adjectively. You can take Shankara as in the literal meaning of auspicious or beneficent, modifying Prabhavam. So Prabhavam Shankaram, they are agreeing in case, number, and gender. So we can take Shankara as an adjective, the beneficent source, the Prabhava, the source that is Shankara, that is beneficent. Or we could take it as a proper name. We praise Shiva. We praise Shiva Shankara, who's the source. So as you see, I've taken it in the first sense. We praise the beneficent source of the Vibhava, the all-pervasive activity of the Shakti Chakra, the wheel of the powers of consciousness. And the tam at the beginning of that second line lends weight to my interpretation, because we praise that Shankara who is the Prabhava. That is to say, what we mean by Shankara is not like, a god up in heaven, but we mean that Shiva is none other than the source, again, the awareness ground, the timeless, formless awareness ground is the Prabhava, the source, the powerful source, the beneficent source of the Vibhava, the all-pervasive activity of the wheel of the powers of consciousness. Now, this wheel of Shaktis, right? The wheel of powers of consciousness means, right, the power of autonomy, the power of awareness, the power of joy, ananda, the power of will, the power of cognition, the power of action, and so on. And there's also other kind of subsidiary powers as well. The power of sovereignty, the power of unfolding, the power of different levels of action. Anyway, all of these Shaktis, these powers of consciousness, these powers are innate to consciousness. This is what makes Tantra different from, say, Vedanta or other non-dual philosophies that say consciousness is infinitely and eternally still. It doesn't do anything. According to Vedanta, consciousness does not do anything. It's an eternal, impartial, passive, static witness. It is simply awareness. It doesn't have any Shakti. And Tantra says, no, consciousness is inherently dynamic. It has inherent capacities or potencies, which is why Tantra argues that the world is real, not an illusion, right? Because if consciousness has no power, then manifestation is not real. It must be an illusion. And Tantra says, no, consciousness has power, and it has the power to manifest everything that it manifests. And the world is real and calls for your engagement, not your renunciation, right? Because that's the practical outcome of these two different views. An illusionist view, in the real world, it calls for renunciation, and a realist view calls for engagement. So that's the practical outcome. Tantrikas are not renunciates. Okay, so so consciousness has these inherent powers. Okay, and one could argue over how many powers does it really have? Maybe some people might think, oh, it has those powers, I see that, but then these other ones seem to be imagination or whatever. But anyway, regardless, it has some inherent powers that give rise to the pralayodaya, give rise to the or bring about manifestation and reabsorption, manifestation and dissolution of the world. So the grammar gets a little bit complicated, but the unmesha, the expansion of the wheel of consciousness, or the expansion of the wheel of the powers of consciousness, is the arising of the world of experience. The contraction of the wheel of the powers of consciousness is the dissolution of the world, right? And this happens on all scales, right? So it happens in a 24-hour cycle. When you go to sleep, you dissolve the world of your experience. When you wake up, or you dissolve the world of the waking state experience anyway, and you give rise to or manifest the world of dream state experience. And then when you wake up, right, there's also deep sleep. You dissolve the dream state when you manifest the deep sleep state. You dissolve the deep sleep state when you again manifest a dream state, and then you dissolve that and manifest a waking state. So here's the main point, that this is a consciousness only view. So what that means is it is pointing out that your habitual perception that there is a statically existing world is nothing other than a habitual perception. That is to say, what is actually happening in your direct experience, should you choose to pay attention to it, is that consciousness is manifesting a whole world of experience that is unique to each conscious perceiver. Meaning to say, though there's much in common, right? The one infinite consciousness manifesting a world of Hareesh experience and manifesting a world of David experience and so on. There's a lot of commonality. There's a lot of overlap. But nonetheless, it's also unique, right? Because the world of experience that consciousness has of itself, as seen from the perspective called David, or Ezra, or Margaret, that is a unique world of experience that is actually manifested. It's not that. I mean, one way to think of this, one metaphor, is that each conscious observer is also a singularity that is spilling forth. There's like a singularity, a bindu point at the center of each locus of awareness that spills forth the content of experience, right? Kind of like the idea in physics of a white hole. Nobody knows whether these actually exist, but it doesn't matter because it's a metaphor. That it's possible that some black holes connect through a wormhole in space to a white hole somewhere else, and the content that they absorb spills out in another point in space-time, not even necessarily at the same era, right? Because it could be a totally different point in space-time where the black hole's contents are spewing out from a singularity that's a white hole, whereby they're actually the same singularity. Anyway, utilizing that as a metaphor, there's one entangled singularity, meaning to say there's one singularity which manifests the world of conscious experience, but that singularity is refracted, into the form isn't the right word, but each of us is that singularity, right? But manifesting a slightly different and sometimes very different world of experience. And that manifestation is a rhythmic pulsation whereby consciousness spews forth the content of its various experiences and then retracts it once again. And this happens, this iteration and reiteration happens on every possible scale. So it happens on this 24-hour scale, but also happens on a scale of lifetimes, right? Where there's a dissolution of this particular vantage point or perspective called Hareesh or David. And that is, that is just another scale of the exact same process of waking and sleeping and waking again, by which consciousness creates and dissolves the various worlds of its experience. So let's press on. Commentary first makes more sense out of the verse. But how can one's essential nature be described as divine in this teaching when one is subject to aging, decay, death, and rebirth? If this is asked, we reply, that by which this world is supported and from which it arises has an essence nature that is not obscured, even in the state of being one who is subject to the conditions of aging, death, and so on. Since it has such a nature, it is never obstructed, and nor does it ever cease to be, and thus is said to be divine. So now read the verse. That in which all this, meaning all phenomena, that in which all this rests and from which it has come forth as an effect, since it has an unveiled nature, there is no obstruction of it anywhere. So what's he saying? That it only appears as if the truth is veiled. It's actually not veiled. And when and realization is precisely that, the realization that the truth was never veiled. It couldn't be. The truth is always hidden in plain sight because there's nowhere else to hide it. Right? So nothing is concealed. The state of ignorance, which is bondage, is the state in which you can't perceive that it's unconcealed. You think it's concealed, and you can't perceive that it's unobstructed. So, two things about this then. One is that he's saying that the realization of what you are necessarily includes the realization that what you are is unborn and undying. That it is not consciousness that is subject to aging, death, and so on. That those the features of the objects of consciousness, like body is subject to aging and death. But body is something that you're conscious of. It is not consciousness itself. It is a manifestation of consciousness, yes, right? But body is one of the objects of consciousness. It is not the subject. So consciousness is not subject to conditions of aging, death, and so on. Consciousness is unborn and undying, and that doesn't make sense until you experientially realize it. This is why, when you realize yourself as consciousness, you can be conscious even while you're asleep. And that's the topic of the next verse, and we'll finish there. Your essence nature, the source of all that you experience, flows equally in all three states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, none of which are other than it. In all these states, the perceiver never departs from its own essential nature. When you know yourself as unborn, undying consciousness, then you can experience all these transformations, like waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, as transformations in the body, in what consciousness manifests through its body mind. Okay, let's do one more verse. We can come back to this next time. One more verse, because this ties it all together. Verse 4, Kallata says, he gives examples of experiences or cognitions. I am happy. I am suffering. I am attached, and so on. Those experiences clearly operate within another larger being, right? They're not independent of consciousness. They're manifestations of consciousness, in which, and so this other larger being is that in which states of happiness, etc., are strung together like beads on a string. The practice is, you ask yourself this simple contemplation question, right? And this is one echoed by Ramana Maharshi and others, but it's here as well. The simple contemplation question is, if you think of a time when you were suffering or grieving or hurting, and if you think of a time when you were happy and joyful, and if you think of another time in which you were just bored, what is it by virtue of which you claim that there's an I who experienced all these, right? Because you say, don't you, I was suffering on that occasion. I was happy on this other occasion. I was bored on this other occasion. What's that I? Meaning to say, what aspect of you is equally present in these three very different experiences by virtue of which you can make this claim? That's what Kallata is calling the thread that the beads are strung on. The beads are the experiences, suffering, happy, bored, whatever. What's the thread? That's the inquiry. And it cannot be answered in words, or at least we're not interested in the verbal conceptual answer. We're interested in the experiential answer. What is it? What is it that was there in all these experiences? It's another way of asking, what is I? Because, you see, if what you are was utterly transformed into the emotion or experience without remainder, then there would be nothing to connect these experiences, right? So even when the suffering is great, you don't become the suffering without remainder. When the happiness is great, you don't become the happiness without remainder. That's just a figure of speech, right? A way of saying there is some aspect of you which is the power by which all these experiences are known, the thread upon which all these beads are strung. You just are empirically, experientially inquiring into that. What is it? Experientially, because you can give a name easy. Consciousness. No, experientially. What is it that experiences all this? Om.